Hello, Mona.
Hello.
Yalla Italia, as you know, is a web magazine that is written and managed by a second generation of Muslims who were born or raised in Italy. So my first question for you is, how does it feel to have a dual citizenship? Which are the moments where you feel more American? When do you feel more Egyptian?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've lived in many different countries. I was born in Egypt. We left Egypt when I was 7 for the UK. So for a very long time, I identified with the UK, especially London, because that was my first image of home, or my first memory of home. And then we moved to Saudi Arabia, but it was so difficult there, I don't identify with Saudi Arabia at all. And then I moved back to Egypt, and then I lived in Israel for a while, and then I moved to the US in 2000. So, if anything, and this sounds like a really big cliche, but I really feel like a global citizen, much more than just Egyptian or American. And I think that's really what many people, especially people of various ethnic backgrounds or people who have grown up in different countries, increasingly identify as, because we see ourselves as belonging to a world that is beyond just one or two identities. I think what has happened, especially with the proliferation of social media, is that it's allowed us to connect with people in different parts of the world and recognize that we carry multiple identities. So my Egyptian identity obviously was the first because I was born in Egypt, but all those other identities also form me. And even though I say Saudi Arabia was very difficult, I became a feminist in Saudi Arabia. So as difficult as it was, Saudi Arabia has made me the woman that I am today.
It's a part of your story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think all of those countries have had an impact on who I am. When I lived in Israel, I became a liberal Muslim because I lived in West Jerusalem, and I was able to see there ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighbors of mine who reminded me of ultra-Orthodox Muslims in Saudi Arabia. And so I recognized that I had more in common with my liberal Jewish neighbors and liberal Christian neighbors than I did with ultra-Orthodox Muslims. So Israel also influenced me because it inspired me to become a liberal Muslim. And then when I moved to the US, it was so many different identities coming together. But I live in New York now. When I first moved to the US, I lived in Seattle, and I wasn't very happy in Seattle. It was too small and too clean and too quiet and boring.
Compared to Cairo.
Compared to Cairo and compared to many other places. But New York really was where I wanted to be. And so I moved to New York 2 years after I arrived in the US. And New York does not belong to the US. New York belongs to the world. All the world is in New York. You hear dozens of languages in New York. You see people from all over the world. I live in Harlem, and when you walk from where I live, all the way south or all the way north, you encounter so many different ethnic groups. So that really is kind of the center of the universe of the global citizen. So I'm Egyptian, I'm American, but I'm also much more.
Great. Speaking about social media, you were mentioning before, regarding the revolution, many people have talked about the importance of social media for communicating and uniting people. And you are one of the clearest examples of how social media impacted journalism yourself when you were arrested and assaulted in Tahrir Square. Used Twitter to communicate with the rest of the world and to say, hey, I'm safe. So don't you think that media in some way have overemphasized the role of social media in the Egyptian revolution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think too many people rush to call what happened the Twitter revolution or the Facebook revolution because, and I think it was very unfair to do that because for a long time activists on the ground had been working against those various regimes, and yes, they did use social media, those of them who had access to social media, but I think to call it a social media revolution ignores the very many years of very courageous and hard work that people on the ground had put into it. These revolutions didn't happen overnight, and these revolutions, when Mubarak, for example, shut down the internet, they survived beyond social media because even though people couldn't tweet or use Facebook, they were still going out on the street and demonstrating against him. So they're beyond social media. I think it's very important to acknowledge that courage, and I know from a lot of people who were involved in the 18 days, for example, in Egypt and others in Tunisia and the other countries, they get very upset when they're called social media revolutions because they want the world to recognize that it's a people's revolution. And I think for a lot of outsiders who don't understand the Middle East and North Africa and who haven't been following the various groups, it's much easier for them to say, oh yeah, it was because of Twitter and Facebook, because that's very easy and it's a very quick kind of explanation of what happened. It's much more complex and difficult and if you haven't been paying attention to the modern history of the region, you won't understand what led to the revolutions. So it's very important to put social media in the place where they belong. But since the revolutions have begun in the various countries, groups continue to use them to communicate, and groups continue to use them to advocate for the various things that they use. And as you said, I used social media to let the world know that I was arrested. And so for many people, they are a lifeline, in that activists will go in and say, because I tweeted, the police treated me better than if I hadn't tweeted, because the world knows, the world is watching through social media. But remember that not everybody in Egypt has access to Twitter, not everybody in Yemen. And one of the biggest examples of this, or one of the kind of the big wake-up calls, was when we had a referendum in Egypt in March of last year to say yes or no to the referendum, to minor changes to the constitution. Most people on Facebook said they were voting no, and they thought that everybody would vote no. And it was actually, I think, 77% voted yes and 23% voted no, which puts Twitter in context in Egypt. It's there, we're very vocal, we're very loud, but we're definitely a minority.
Speaking also about categories, you yourself define yourself as a liberal Muslim, and several times you mentioned the Muslim right wing when talking about conservative views of Islam. But I was wondering whether this could be a bit risky. I mean, pandering to this bipolarized view of the Muslim world as divided between conservative Muslim and liberal Muslim, as the reality sometimes is much more complex and rich, and there are national peculiarities that cannot just be reduced to this bipolar view. So what's your view about this?
No, I see where you're coming from, and the last thing I want to do is reduce the Muslim world or the Muslim worlds, because there are many, there isn't just one, into easy labels. But what I try to do by calling myself a liberal Muslim and pointing out that there is such a thing as a liberal Muslim is to break this definition, or to challenge the definition that the only way to be a Muslim is to be a conservative Muslim, and the only authentic Muslim is a conservative Muslim. And I think this is something that the Islamic worlds or the Muslim communities, wherever they happen to be, have to go through. Because for a very long time we've been silenced by those who are conservative, and they've used this idea that I'm not authentic because I don't do what they do, and you're not authentic because you don't do what they do, and the only way to be authentic is to follow this laundry list they give you of how to be a good Muslim. Well, there are many ways of being a good Muslim, and they don't own that list. That list, I think, is a personal list between you and God. So it's very important, I think, to place them where they are on the spectrum, which is in the right wing, because that way also it connects them to the other right wing, which, it's interesting that the conservative Muslims try to say the only way to be a Muslim is conservative. And then conservative Europeans, or conservatives on the political front of Europe, who are Islamophobic, or what they try to do is reduce Muslims to conservative. They point to all Muslims and say, all Muslims are crazy, all Muslims are fanatics, all Muslims are this. So basically the two right wings are talking to each other, and they feed into each other's stereotype of each other. And the rest of us who don't identify as conservative are lost. So we need to be able to create a space for all of us. I say I'm conservative, but someone else can come along and say, I'm in the middle, I'm 2/3 that way, wherever they want. But what I would love to see actually is something that the Jewish community has, or Jews have generally, which is you have Orthodox, you have conservative, you have Reform, and you have Reconstructionist. And that way, you feel you have a community that you identify with according to how observant you are, according to whether you identify with it more as a cultural thing, or something that because your family had it, or because of the country you lived in. It gives you a multiplicity of ways to identify. But my main purpose is to break the stranglehold that conservative Muslims, especially imams and especially conservative scholars, have over Muslim identity. I think Muslim identity is much more plural than the one that they give us.
Great. Now a very difficult question: how to empower women? I'm thinking of a debate that occurred, I think, 2 years ago or something, between you and Tariq Ramadan. And he was basically leaving aside Tariq Ramadan. But his point was like, instead of imposing a certain dress code to a certain ethnic minority by law, we should rather empower women with education and social involvement. So we cannot impose that by law. So I would like to know your opinion about this. How can we empower women in the Muslim world, but also in the Muslim diaspora, so even here in Europe?
Right. Well, the TV interview that you're referring to was a very interesting sociological experiment, which proved everything Tariq Ramadan said to be wrong, because he was claiming that we should allow the Muslim community to debate all these very difficult issues among themselves, because that's much better than imposing anything from the outside. And of course, I don't want to impose anything from the outside. We were arguing over niqab and the French ban on the face veil, and I made it very clear I detest Sarkozy. I think he's a xenophobe. I do not like many people in the French government, etc., etc. But when I tried to say this, when I tried to respond to Tariq Ramadan, what did you see him do? He wouldn't let me speak. And so this idea that the Muslim community can discuss this, for people like Tariq Ramadan, basically means let the men in the Muslim community discuss this and we will figure out a way. Because here is a woman, and you know, I have a loud voice, I speak very fast, I'm a feminist, I'm strong, you know, I fight everybody, and he wouldn't even let me speak. So can you imagine what it's like for the average young woman who has to fight patriarchy on so many levels, and who in France or in Italy or anywhere else is fighting not just patriarchy in her family or her community, but a racism from outside that is directed towards her community. So there are multiple levels now of repression, basically. So she has sexism, she has racism, and if her brothers are experiencing racism up here, she's also experiencing it, but her brothers and her fathers and Tariq Ramadan are also repressing her. So this is a myth, and it's this utopia that we can sit down and discuss it, because no, there are very conservative voices who do not want all the voices to speak out. Now, this ties into the question you just asked me. It's a very risky thing to say this, because when I say this, I can see the European right wing immediately take this and say, you see, Muslim men silence Muslim women, they don't let them speak, Islam discriminates against women, Islam treats women like fifth-class citizens, all of this. So it's a minefield. It's a very, very difficult and very sensitive issue, which is why I constantly bring up the right wings. There are two right wings. I think Muslim women are stuck between two right wings. The political right wing that is racist and xenophobic against all of us, and the Muslim right wing that claims to speak on behalf of all of us to fight the Islamophobes, but silences us in the process. So we have to develop ways to speak out against both of them, so that neither of them use the other's arguments against me. Because at the end of the day, you know, this is just like Egypt. When Egyptians rose up against Mubarak, everybody had Mubarak up here, and they weren't really talking about gender issues and women's rights. But for me, this revolution will never succeed unless we talk about women's rights, because Mubarak oppressed all Egyptians. But then Egyptian society, because it's so conservative and patriarchal, oppresses Egyptian women even more. So who now is at the bottom of the ladder? It's women. So and that's what I'm saying. Well, that's what I say when I talk about these very difficult issues that I argued with Tariq Ramadan about. Don't tell me that we can solve this only by talking within the Muslim community. I wish we could. We've been trying for a very long time, but people like you won't let me speak. So this is very messy. It's very sensitive, and it can be used against us being the Muslim community. I recognize this, and I see my writing sometimes being used against me by the right wing, but that should not silence us. That's not the way to go. The way to go is to tell people like Tariq Ramadan, you do not speak for me, and to tell people like Sarkozy, I don't need you to protect me. I'm going to fight my fights by myself.
And so you think that the change